Okay, welcome everybody to First Amendment Voices, second in a three-part series on religious freedom today. And we are super excited for this conversation. It will be around supporting women and girls who are persecuted for their faith. And we started last week hearing from younger generation voices, emerging faith leaders talking about some of the trends that they've been seeing and experiencing. And we will conclude on Wednesday with a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Paul Murray, who's on our board, on trends inside, religious trends inside of the United States. And so today, though, we're going to hear from some incredible speakers, and I'm really excited. Thank you. I do want to thank Chelsea Langston Bombino for bringing these speakers together, along with Luann, and who is our moderator. And Chelsea is also on our board, and we are really excited because she wears a lot of hats for us. And so, but religious freedom and her faith has been a guiding principle for her, and is something that she really delivers a lot of value to us with. So we are just grateful for that. I'm going to give the audience a little bit of instruction right now, and we'll reiterate that a little bit further on in the program in the chat too when we get to the Q&A time. But if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you can click on the Q&A function, and that will pop open a little Q&A box, and then you can submit your questions in that Q&A function box. Please don't send them in the chat. Although if you want to let our speakers know how awesome they're doing and send encouragement, that's always welcome. Put that in the chat. But put all our questions in the Q&A function. What that allows is other audience members to vote on your question. And if they like a question, they can click on the thumbs up icon, and the most voted, the up votes, will put that question at the top of the queue and make it more likely that we'll get to it. So definitely take advantage of that. We try to make our programming as interactive as possible for our audience, and that's a big part of it. So please participate from that perspective. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our moderator today, Luann Sabatier. Thank you so much, Luann, for joining us, and I'll let you introduce the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I do want to add that I spend a good bit of my time as the Director of Communications for 21 Wilberforce, and that is a global Christian nonprofit working around the world on education and training in regards to international religious freedom. And it is through that work with 21 Wilberforce that I met my two colleagues. First, I'll introduce Elizabeth Lane Miller. And Elizabeth is with the co-director of research, and her background's in gender persecution, and she does that work for Open Doors International. And then also we have Judy Golub, and Judy has spent her entire career, or the most of it, in advocacy for various human rights, human interests, and in particular the last 15 years with international religious persecution, most recently with USERF. She's now with Religion News Foundation. And notice I didn't read their bios one by one. We've got that on the webpage. So I trust if you want to know more about their phenomenal background. Also want to take this opportunity to say they're also my colleagues, as well as two other people across the world, Helene Fisher and Emma Dipper. And we have Faranaz Zipsahani, and the six of us are working on standing up a global network accelerator for women in FORB, freedom of religion or belief. So that initiative is about ready to launch. And so we're very excited to share today on that topic. A little bit of housekeeping myself, Steve. Let me just say, no matter how you vote on the question, if I like it, I'm going to ask it. So I don't want anybody to feel bad if your question's not floating up to the top, okay? But we will try to work everyone in. And one of the things we're going to do today, he talked about engagement and interactive. We're not going to do 10 minutes here, 10-minute statement there. We're having a conversation. We invite you to come along with that. And again, your questions, I'll watch them on the screen as they're going up, no matter how they're ranked. Most likely, I will hold them till the end, and we're going to allow plenty of time to get those in. So, but don't forget it. So if you want to go ahead and post it, even though we're going to hold that question to the end, I just wanted to let you know, we do want to hear from you. So what I'd like to do is begin with some research that was conducted by Elizabeth and the team at Open Doors International. And she'll tell you a little more about that, but actually that's the latest study. She's been doing this for over a decade. The latest study actually is coming out this week. But I'd like to quote something and then ask her, we're going to share some slides with you, some visuals. But one of the things that struck me is Elizabeth said, religious persecution is not gender neutral. Instead, persecution is tailored to target people at their most vulnerable. This, unfortunately, has a disproportionate impact on women and girls. So with that, Elizabeth, I'll ask you, I'm going to share my screen and I'll ask you to kick off our conversation, and then Judy will jump in.
Great. Thanks, Lou. So I did join Open Doors International, their international office, in 2016. And in 2017, we began investigating gender-specific religious persecution. And we did that through some mixed method researching. I'm able to share from 5 years worth of research and reporting. And you can see here the different reports over those 5 years. SRP is our term. It stands for specific religious persecution. Now, these findings have really given us a granular understanding of what Open Doors World Watch Research has been trying to investigate on how religious persecution is specific for men or for women. And in 2021, we also added the lens of looking at children and youth. So that was a new report. This is exciting to us because it really takes the understanding of individual experiences out of the anecdotal and into the systemic. Our 5th report is being released tomorrow, and wanted to give this as background because these are the reports and the research that will form the basis of information that I share with you today. Our research does focus on the Christian faith, but as you're going to hear us talk about, we suspect that these findings are true more broadly. So I just want to say that at the beginning and say, as you hear this from, our database is looking at the Christian faith, but maybe if you're from another faith or belief group and as you hear this, you might suspect that these parallel experiences of the other faith groups that you may be aware of or you may serve or be a part of personally. We just really invite you to listen for those parallels, and we, although we can't say them from a research standpoint, we do suspect that they are true, and would love for you to conduct research among your trusted networks on this topic. So that's where we're coming from. Now, the area of research. Well, I think this is a great visual to talk about the intersection. We're talking about the intersection between a person's vulnerabilities, their vulnerabilities as a member of a marginalized or minority religious community, and their vulnerabilities from their gender as a man or a woman. It's really an intersection between the attacks on their freedom of religion or belief and their gender equality. And we found there's a clear distinction in how men and women experience persecution, religious persecution, because of their faith. Now, you might ask how these interact. And sometimes it's as simple as using the language of a crime drama. Motive, means, and opportunity. Now, when detectives solve a crime, they look for these three things. And we have seen similarly that when an individual violates the human rights of a Christian, and it's motivated by religious differences, they often do so by using means of their sociocultural context to identify available opportunities. You can see how these two arrows, when they come together, they provide that opportunity to inflict harm. And this is where we really see gender inequality, especially playing a role for women and girls. Now, this can occur in areas where there are compounding factors, or what we might call exacerbating factors. These exacerbating factors can provide fuel to this process at any point. These factors might be poverty, they could be scarcity of resources, corruption, displacement, ethnic or tribal conflict, political conflict, criminal gangs, militia, other crises, the list could go on. All these exacerbating factors add to what is already an intersection in these two areas of vulnerability. And this is really the area that we're talking about, is we're talking about religious persecution, and in particular, how it's affecting women and girls.
Thank you for kind of framing our discussion today. And I'm going to ask Judy Golub, who spends a lot of her time, and she'll explain that to you, on advocating for those who are vulnerable, religious prisoners of conscience in particular. And today she's going to speak about women. Judy.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth's work underscores what I, as an advocate, has found, that you need good information. And as an advocate, the issue is how you use that information. But let me step back and talk about religious persecution and what it is. It's being persecuted due to your religious beliefs or non-belief, as well as your religious practices, activities, and advocacy. And people can be persecuted because they're religious minorities or they're dissenting members of majority communities, for example. Now, I started as an advocate to focus on individuals because I found that when you focus on big numbers, people got numb. What can you do when you talk about 1 million people being displaced? What can you do about the Christians in Iraq, which had a huge number, now being only 200,000? By focusing on an individual, you get to the heart of the matter, and you get to people's hearts. And what motivates people to be advocates, it's less in their heads than what's in their heart. And when I started working on religious prisoner of conscience, I noticed that there were fewer women than men being detained in all but, say, 2 countries. And I wondered about that. And I wondered what that meant. It became clear through the great work of Elizabeth and other people at Open Doors and other places, that the character of the persecution of women and girls differed from that of men. While women can be imprisoned, and you see 3 of the women we'll talk about later, and girls who have been imprisoned because of their religious beliefs, and their imprisonment may differ from men's imprisonment, women also find themselves persecuted from a whole confluence of other more hidden activities, which I think Elizabeth and I will talk about later. And when we get back to what Elizabeth talked about, again, we're getting back to where I started, the need for good information. If your information isn't good, your advocacy isn't good. And if your advocacy isn't good because of bad information, you violate the cardinal rule of what work an advocate does, is you do no harm. So
Thank you, Judy. Do no harm. With that, I think it's interesting to discuss this issue using relevant factors, as Judy said, looking at data, and we're going to dimension it how it impacts women and girls. And so the groundbreaking, and it truly was, research that Open Doors has done over the last 5 studies indicates some findings, some key nuggets, and we're going to focus our discussion on those key nuggets. So if you're taking notes, here's the first 2 words. The persecution of women takes place across all faiths. So Elizabeth, do you want to shed some light on that?
Sure. Thanks for showing this map, because it just helps everyone get a visual of where the data I'm talking about comes from, which countries we're looking at. And as you take a look at the different nations represented here, we're not looking at one identical religion that's common to all of these nations at all. There's multiple religions found and multiple customs found throughout the countries represented here. And in addition, some of our data also comes from some additional countries in Central and South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, which are part of what we call our persecution watch countries list. So there are even some more there as well. And as I mentioned, our research focuses on Christian faith, but we suspect these findings are true more broadly. This visual helps start to get at why I said that we suspect they're more broadly true. So religious persecution, from what we can tell, has narrowed in on what society says are a man or a woman's strength, or is perceived as their value and purpose in their social context. So again, we're talking their social context, their society. These are things I'm talking about. They're not religion specific. They're sociocultural. And that means theoretically, they can manifest similar dynamics across multiple beliefs. So absolutely, we're looking across multiple faiths and beliefs at how each gender is experiencing this religious persecution. And I just want to unpack this a minute. A couple of the things we have highlighted on this visual. We have for men, that they're often targeted through as their role as provider and role as church leader. Let me just talk about that a minute. We often see that they're targeted through economic harassment because they are considered to be socially providers for their families. We've had any number of respondents explain that removing or limiting a man or a boy's ability to provide for his family through his work, whether it's job loss or imprisonment or physical attack, weakens the dependent family and leaves them vulnerable, as well as shaming the man or boy who is unable to provide. Similarly, we see church leaders or any spiritual leaders are targeted or more likely to be victims of physical violence because of what they represent for the community. So for men in these traditional societies, largely, 2 sociocultural roles are at the center of how they're targeted. But on the other hand, women and girls, it's great to see the contrast. I know we're talking about women and girls, but it's great to see how it differs from the men. Women and girls are more likely targeted for their perceived sexual purity and their family status. Well, you might say, why is that an effective way? Well, it's because whether the honor of the family in many of these places is associated with the perceived sexual purity of a woman. So if she is raped, sexually assaulted, abducted, or forcibly married, this is a great way to attack that role that she's playing in the society. Or you can see any number of these things have to do with her family status as a daughter, wife, or mother. If that's the social role she's playing, then we're seeing that's a great way to target her. Again, none of these are necessarily religion oriented. Some religions do reinforce these social gender roles, but they're not specific to one religion. And so therefore we see the way men and women are targeted in religious persecution has to do with non-religious factors, social roles. So maybe Judy could speak to how she sees this, because I haven't included any specific examples.
Well, Elizabeth is right. it does take place, persecution does take place across all faiths and within all faiths. And I give some examples. You have in China, Gulmira Imi, who is a Uyghur Muslim, who is now in a concentration camp because the Chinese Communist government fears the Uyghur Muslims and is trying to eradicate them and their religion. And in fact, US government and others have declared genocide being committed against them. So Gulmira Imi, it's important to say her name and to know her face. In Iran, there's a woman named Golgraf Ibrahimi Ere, who's a Shia Muslim. She's from the majority faith, but she's now in detention and in prison because she objected to the Iranian government's interpretation of Islam that allows the stoning of women for adultery. And if you looked at her specifics of her case, you will see that she has been arrested, detained, put on trial in absentia, released, detained, sent to several different prisons, and conducted a hunger strike. I mean, I had to literally list all the things that had happened to her that we know of, because a lot we do not know of. And then you have Leah Sharabu, who was 14 years old when she was abducted by an offshoot of ISIS in Nigeria. Now, she was abducted because she refused to renounce her Christian faith, and they now view her as a slave. We know her name, we know her faith, but we do not know the names and faces of thousands of Yazidi women who have still been kidnapped and are slaves from the Iraq war. And I could go on and on. If you talk about religious minorities, women and girls in Russia and Myanmar, there's very disturbing trends now in India, which Open Doors has done a great report on, and Afghanistan, especially given the Taliban ruling there now. Now, and then you can look at other countries like Saudi Arabia, like Eritrea, and I can go on and on and on. So remember, when Elizabeth talks about these overall trends, you can put a face and a name to the victims of a lot of these trends. And sadly, we don't know the names and faces of a lot of hundreds of thousands of women and girls who are also suffering this persecution. It's my job as an advocate to try to find out their names, to try to get their faces out there, and to craft a campaign to support them.
Thank you, Judy. I believe another discovery that you referenced early on, Elizabeth, just in your opening, and Judy also, that the persecution is hidden. Could you explain what that means?
Absolutely. And we again put up the contrast here in terms of the persecution for men. Sorry about the ringing, I apologize. About men is focused, severe, and visible. And we're talking about severely violent there when we use the word severe. But women tends to be violent, more broadly violent. We'll talk about that in the complexity in a minute, but hidden. Now, Judy's just given us great insight into specific names that we know, but the fact that we don't know so many names. If I were to put some trends to help illustrate what is invisible, trying to make visible the invisible or the hidden, then I would have to go back to that intersection I was telling you about the fact that so often what happens in terms of religious persecution for women and girls is that it's hidden within socially acceptable practices. It's embedded into the legal and sociocultural environment. So you might have patterns of discrimination, harassment, and violence that are built into structures that shape daily life across the world. These structures, especially legal frameworks or like parallel legal systems, can create impunity for perpetrators. Now, what does this look like? I want to compare the top pressure points facing men and women, so you can see the difference between the more visible and the more hidden. And Judy's already told us that the the number of religious prisoners of conscience that are female is much lower. And this goes with the general trends that we see. In orange, we have two different types of imprisonment. In the men's side, we have imprisonment by government or pseudo-governmental actors. But for women, it's house arrest. It's within the domestic sphere. And, you know, this really, I want to talk for a moment about house arrest, just so we make sure we can see the difference of what it is. If you're imprisoned by government, it tends to be more registered. It tends to be, you know, recorded, not in all cases. And Judy could talk about that if she wanted to. But for house arrest, we're not talking about the government is keeping you under house arrest within your own home. We're not talking about the comfortable version we might think of in America with an ankle bracelet given to you by the government. We're talking about any variety of severity, but this is being confined to a room, usually by your family or by your captors. And, you know, an example that's hit the headlines in the past couple of months, it's not religious in nature, but is a shocking and horrifying example of house arrest, is the news that went viral about the woman in China who was chained in a 3-sided shed. And that just illustrates the often inhumane conditions that some women face under so-called house arrest. Not everyone's conditions are so awful and harsh, but this woman in China, for instance, her situation has been invisible, has been hidden for years and years and years and years. And likewise, for many women and girls who are discriminated or persecuted because of their faith, their house arrest is very difficult to see. It's hidden, as in contrast with the men's. Now, another factor, you're going to see that the top 5 pressure points for women on the right-hand side also underscore the subordinate role of women and girls within family and community and how it's exploited. And sexual violence is the top pressure point facing women and girls, and forced marriage is the second one. That again gets at why it's hidden. Well, it's hidden within sometimes the domestic sphere. Forced marriage is a marriage where both parties do not fully consent to their marriage. And it's worth noting that it can grant like a legal or religious covering for ongoing sexual violence. We were really grateful to Aid to the Church in Need a year or two ago for noting that they said that first and foremost, these young women are victims of horrible and mortifying crimes for the rest of their lives, where the semblance of marriage is abandoned. Because they are also condemned to live as slaves in terror, they are robbed of the most fundamental human rights and freedom. And they think we should switch to calling this sexual enslavement through religious coercion. I think they're right to point out the fact that even calling it marriage is a way of condoning it. And they point out the fact that this kind of use of marriage to persecute a woman and girl also violates multiple other human rights, such as freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, their right to liberty and security of their person, the right to educate their children in accordance to their beliefs, and or freedom from slavery. I mean, so there's so much captured within the idea of forced marriage that is further hidden, you know, even as much as we are able to say, hey, this is an area that just doesn't get seen. We don't know the names. And this way that women and girls experience religious persecution. And this is not just 1 year. If you look over our past 5 years, just want to quickly say that sexual violence and forced marriage have consistently ranked in the top 2 pressure points over the past 5 years. And if you go to the next slide, Lou, you can see what those are. Over the 5 years of our research, those have been consistently there. And it's just an ongoing means of targeting women and girls.
What I'd like to know is, Judy, how do these factors or these circumstances, both individually and collectively, how do they impact, or should they not dictate, but guide how we do advocacy on their behalf?
Thank you, Lou. I think it makes our advocacy efforts both more important and more complex. It makes it harder. We know that the persecution is often hidden, and this is often hidden behind the closed walls of a prison or closed walls of a house. So we've heard reports that Gulmira Emin has been raped in prison and in the camps, and as has thousands of other Uyghur women who experience sexual violence, some forced marriages, some physical violence, and surely a lot of psychological violence that are taking place within the prison and outside the prison. So it makes the advocacy harder, but it makes it more important. We know for a fact that governments don't like being criticized and don't like it highlighted when organizations or a government registers concern and opposition to the imprisonment of a woman in violation of the religious freedom. We also know that while this kind of advocacy cannot always free the woman, we know from information we get, it may make their terms of confinement easier. They may get a blanket, they may get some extra food, they may get a little more positive attention as opposed to negative attention, because the governments don't like being pointed out to and criticized. And occasionally it does lead to someone's freedom, but we know that we have to keep on doing it. For those who are persecuted behind the doors of the house, it makes it more complicated. In both cases, you need to have the information. In both cases, you need to understand some of the cultural dimensions, but especially with the kind of persecution Elizabeth talks about, you need to know more. You need to know more about what kind of messages help, and importantly, what kind of messenger helps. Because again, you want to help the situation, you don't want to do any harm. It makes it complicated, but it makes it more important.
Wow, and I'll come back to that in our Q&A session. But you both have used words complicated, complex. So I'd like to, let's just see. Having a little technical glitch here. Here we go. Can you speak to that, to the complexity, Elizabeth?
Sure. So as I've been talking about the ways that the areas we catalog that women and girls or men and boys experience religious persecution, I've been talking about pressure points. And this is a term we use to refer to both pressures and violence faced in the course of religious persecution. They're areas of particular sensitivity or vulnerability within a religious community by gender. And we have borrowed this term actually from the martial arts context, where a pressure point is like a point, that, in our physical bodies that when pressure is applied to causes crippling pain more than what might seem like from the force applied. And similarly, pressure points in terms of religious persecution are means that that really are areas that can be exploited more easily than some others. So we catalog these different areas and we categorize them. We categorize the ways that the results that we have into 5 main categories. We've listed 4 of them here: economic factors, political and legal factors, security factors, and social and cultural factors. The 5th one that we don't have listed here is technology, and we don't really feel like we had enough distinction or data to include it on this graph. Now, out of these 4 areas, we mapped out the spread of pressure points impacting Christian women versus Christian men in our kind of like top 50 most hostile countries that we study. And you can see that the concentration of pressure points with men predominantly is looking at economic and security concerns. That's that little purple line on the inside. But in contrast, for women, we have a far wider spread of pressure points, especially in the sociocultural areas and the political and legal. Now, the political and legal tends to deal with legal inequalities, whereas the sociocultural often has to do with the fact that within the home, there is a subordinate role that many women and girls play, or a vulnerability, especially within patriarchal systems that leave women with very little say or agency on their own. But this creates a wider spread of ways that women and girls are targeted. Therefore, when they are dealing with trying to express their religious convictions, take part in their chosen religious practices, or even just decide to tell their family they identify as a different belief, then the number of ways that they might be tried to be coerced or pressured to leave that faith is far greater than the number of ways that more concentrated ways that men are pressured.
Lou, you're on mute.
We'll be glad to share those slides with you after the presentation. I want to do a little recap. We've got 2 more points and then we'll open it up. And I see we have a good question here to begin with. So we've talked about this persecution can be across all faiths or religions or beliefs. We've focused briefly on the hiddenness aspect of it. We've talked about the complexity of it. What I'd like to do is, and Judy, this is for you. And the reason this question, by the way, is going to Judy is Elizabeth and her team. It's highly sensitive and confidential, a lot of their data. And so it is not appropriate to ask her questions about regions or countries. But what I can say to Judy is, in all your years of advocacy for religious prisoners of conscience, can you speak to that there is no country where this doesn't occur? And can you also share with us where you think are some particularly acute areas right now?
Well, thank you, Lou. I think that over the years, I think that I found that China and Iran are equal opportunity persecutors. They will persecute women, they will persecute men, they will persecute and people of all religions. And that's been pretty consistent over the years. And it's interesting to find that I've talked before about women largely are less detained in prison than men, with some exceptions. And just anecdotally, I think China and Iran are those exceptions, sadly. And sadly, I think there's more persecution taking place today, religious persecution taking place today around the world than in those countries than before. I think Nigeria is especially troubling, both in terms of the hidden and unhidden persecution of women. And there are very disturbing trends in India, especially over, well, I think that's been the case for the last 10, 12 years. You can see it. In fact, if you look at just some of the states in India by themselves, they could have had the designation of country of particular concern years ago, given the level and violence of religious persecution there. And I think we owe it to pay special attention to Afghanistan now, given what's going on there as well. I wish I could be more sanguine about the status of religious freedom and the status of religious freedom for women and girls around the world, but I think it's getting worse, not better.
And one of the things also in terms of all the areas that you studied, Elizabeth. I mean, we have then current events can compound, as you mentioned, COVID, or even what's happening in Ukraine or Afghanistan in particular. Is there anything that either of you, before I open it up for questions, that you would like to mention about how current events can compound the situation?
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to how some of the COVID-19 measures have unintentionally perhaps made some of these issues more difficult to address. While they were, intended as protective measures, millions of people, primarily women and children, became more vulnerable overnight if they were, for instance, potentially locked in with their abusers, or with state resources diverted to handle pandemic. Then it made it more difficult to have some of those resources, addressing some of the vulnerabilities they were facing that were non-COVID related. According to a UN report, women have experienced consistently higher rates of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse since the pandemic began. And we've seen this. A young woman from Southeast Asia gave us permission to share her experience. Her name has been changed for security purposes, but we changed it to Lachina. And she was abducted and forcibly married right before COVID lockdown restrictions began in her country in, kind of spring of 2020. And the lockdowns and the needs surrounding COVID, which did divert those, resources of police, really meant that her family and the authorities were very much delayed in being able to search for her. And furthermore, her own opportunities for escape were especially low, as her abductor and his family rarely left the home. It's not that it created the opportunity, but it did provide an avenue to make it worse. It further isolated, further trapped this young woman. And it really wasn't until there was an opportunity where her abductor and his family left the home one day after something like 2 months that she actually found opportunity to escape and to seek help and be reunited with her family. So we've just seen that some of these measures, as a current event happens, it can make this, be an exacerbating factor.
Okay. Judy, anything to add?
The prison conditions are never good in these countries, and COVID is an additional problem for a lot of prisoners of conscience. In fact, I've heard reports that some of the prisoner of conscience I've been following have gotten COVID in prison. And you can imagine a lot of people who are displaced, women and girls along with family have been displaced. It's more opportunities for COVID to spread. In terms of Ukraine, we're looking at the religious communities there, be they the Orthodox Kiev community members who split from the Moscow Orthodox Church. You have a Jewish community there. You have some Greek Orthodox and some Muslims there, all of whom I don't think would benefit to be under Russian control.
Okay.
So there's concern there as well.
I'm going to open up for questions. I do want to add something, and it's very timely. March 8th, someone, Elizabeth and Judy and Steve, I'll share with you, who comes to mind is, if you don't know her case, you can read her book, which comes out March 8th, Maryam Ibrahim. And Maryam experienced 2 or 3 of your pressure points. And I won't go into her story right now, but she is taken what had happened to her and turned it into a lifetime of advocacy now while she's still raising her family. But her book that will be released March 8th is called Shackled, and it was co-written with Eugene Bach, and it is her journey. And it very much resonates with a lot of the points that Elizabeth's research and Judy's advocacy. So she took her personal pain and has become an advocate. So it's Marian Ibrahim, and the book is Shackled. I'd like to encourage you. We've got 14 minutes for questions. Also, again, I'll share that if you registered on your own, we have your email, so we will provide our slides to Steve and Chelsea, and they can determine how to distribute those. So a couple questions, both from the same person. I may not be able to pronounce your name properly, Haneko. But it's very long, so I'm going to just first of all, how can we advocate for basic human rights for women in a way that reach beyond the walls of the home, but it holds the importance of home in the social fabric? Have you found that working through faith-based groups is more effective, nonprofit organizations? So in terms of advocacy, while honoring the home, the various ways on how to advocate. Judy, I'll let you take that one first.
Thank you. I think it's always important to work in coalition with other organizations after you get the information. And I think you're right to talk about this tension between religion being a positive force of cohesion for community working together. And you want to try to use that to help free these women. And the best way to do that is in coalition with other groups. To make sure you got the right message and you have the right messengers to say it. I also think to help with the information, I will look at US Commission on International Religious Freedoms website, where they have information on prisoners of conscience, and they have an FORB victims list. And there's something called the Defending Freedoms Project, which is a project of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which has a lot of information as well. I was a child growing up during the Soviet Jewry movement. And when I was growing up, every single synagogue and temple adopted a prisoner of conscience to support. And that working together made all the difference. And a lot of times these people were in prison or they were confined in their house or in Siberia. But working together always is a positive thing to do.
Elizabeth, do you want to add anything about the home element? Because I don't think it's in lieu of, they're in tandem. Do you want to, anything you want to add?
Absolutely. When we point out the fact that the domestic sphere is often a place of these events happening, we are not advocating that there be no privacy within the domestic sphere, but that there be appropriate measures to provide safety. And we do think that policy and national level policy can make a big difference as to some of the protective measures and options for women and girls should they find themselves in unsafe situations. Now, I also want to mention that kind of faith-based, so I think my answer would be different groups have different roles to play. So some would be, advocate for this legal or policy, but if maybe faith-based groups would see the distinction, the nuance that, although we're talking about forced marriage, that upholding all types of marriage, and I would call them false marriages when they're not the consent of both parties, is not within the faith-based organization's best interest to say that all marriages are good and should be upheld. But yeah, Judy.
If I can add, this is where the advocacy, a lot of times advocacy is public advocacy, and there's a lot of times where advocacy is private advocacy. And some of this could be a case where you have private advocacy with religious leaders talking to other religious leaders privately to try to deal with the situation. So I think it's an important distinction when you use either and both.
Yeah.
I'd like to combine two questions. Haneko asked a question, but also I want to get to Alan's question because they're similar in nature. And I do appreciate this because we're not a movement trying to be anti-men. Matter of fact, any advocacy I've seen involved for this particular gender persecution, we have as many men involved in it as we do women. So Alan asked, how would you compare religious persecution that targets women to the historical treatment of women in general by men? And then added to that, Haneko said, I've seen some examples of sensitization and support circles for men to help them break concepts of women engagement in government. So basically what I want to say is, let's talk about the intersection of men. Does freedom of religion or belief, or this gender persecution because of belief, where do men come in terms of general societal trends, and also in their ability to help advocate and advance awareness for this and some forward momentum? I'll start, Elizabeth.
Well, I'll start by the part of the question that Alan asked, that's, asking how is it different? And one of the things that we've ended up calling, I don't know that it's necessarily a research term, but if all women in a given society might be vulnerable to some persecution, and I would point out, it's not just at the hands of men, it's at the hands of other women. Very, very often, women are perpetuating some of this religious persecution against other women. And that's very, very important to understand. That, that there might be some of this maybe generic inequality or persecution happening for those marginalized, but then those within the religious community would say, even more so, do they experience this use, because they're using existing means even more so for religious persecution. So I do think it's important to understand, first of all, the distinction of who is perpetuating this is not just one gender, and the fact that the reason we see it as different than just for all women is because it's additionally used for other means. And in terms of just making sure that there's balance, this is why, and I would encourage you to go and look at our report. This has ill effects for men as well, experiencing religious persecution. We're just focusing here on women and girls.
And Judy, in terms of advocates, crossing the lines.
Well, so just as women and men persecute women, women and men need to be advocates for women and men. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like at this moment, we're focusing on the persecution of women and girls, because I for one, think they haven't gotten, that kind of persecution hasn't gotten that much attention, but people need to advocate for both and need to work together to advocate for both. And once you work together to advocate for both, you develop trust, and then you can work more effectively on both. So we need both to work on persecution for everybody.
So I don't know if this is answering Haneko's question about government in particular, but in terms of faith-based organizations, Tear Fund has an excellent curriculum they've put together called Transforming Masculinities that seeks to especially engage the men of the community. And it is from a Christian perspective, but seeks to engage the men of the community in supporting the women and girls of the community, seeing the whole. So there are, and I'm just pointing that one out because I think it's really well done. There are a number of different ones. World Vision has done some for different faith beliefs. There are any number of resources out there that are very important that help, with that, encourage that teamwork that Judy's talking about.
And one of the things, as we're getting close to wrapping up, that can help curb it is awareness. So we're grateful today very much to our host for allowing us to bring this important topic to you in a webinar. But also, this is why, as Elizabeth pointed out and Judy, study the research. This research, what I love about what Open Doors puts out there is it's accessible and approachable. So while it's buttoned up on its methodology and the data has really not been questioned to my knowledge in terms of its integrity, you can understand it. And so Being informed is the very first step in curbing awareness. So anything, this is not asking for PR, but anything you can do to share that information. First of all, you have to make someone curious before you can start to curb something or providing some remedies. What I also appreciate, that, if I may recap what came out today, and oh my goodness, it has been such a steep learning curve for me over the last 7 years. I appreciate Judy's work, is advocacy. It does start with a heart and caring, but there is very much a science to this. And if you truly want to do no harm, while we talk about how can you curb this, as importantly is how can you advocate? So while we want to point people to engagement, it's engagement that makes meaningful, concrete steps forward, as Judy said, that do no harm. So if you'd like to learn more, there's many groups out there, and we'll try to put a couple of resources together for you where you can get some training. I will say Judy is joined in with us. 21 Wilberforce has on the Global Freedom Center, it's free, no charge. We have a 6-step tutorial on how to advocate. And a lot of these principles are there, while they may not be for women. So you can do it. You can do it in your group, in your literary club, in your neighborhood, in your place of faith or worship, among your friends. But what we ask you is to please be respectful on doing things that are going to have a positive impact. And so while it could be well-intentioned, we don't want to do something that could draw some negative harm. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Again, thank you to Steve, our host, First Amendment Voice, and to Chelsea Langston Bombino for her work and encouraging us for what we're doing, to my colleagues Judy Golub and Elizabeth Lane Miller. And with that, we will say goodbye. And I just hope that we made you a little curious and you'll take another step to explore this topic. Thank you very much.